Hi, my name is Stewart Lynch, and this is the first in a series of 4 videos where we will explore different view gesture modifiers in SwiftUI. In this video, we look at TapGesture and LongPressGesture. Now, you may think that there is not a lot to learn here, but we will try to take a deeper dive into understanding how to read the documentation so that you can take advantage of what is possible. And this will set you up for a better understanding of the more complex gestures to follow. In the process, we'll be looking at different forms of the gesture modifiers, modifier arguments, composite gestures, and gesture state. If this is something you want to learn, then keep watching. A starter project for all of the videos in this series can be downloaded using the link in the notes below. When you open the file, you'll find you have the starter SwiftUI views for all of the different gestures. I'll be using the preview mode for all of these, but if you want to run on a device, then you'll have to open the scene delegate file and edit the let content view equals content view line and change that view on the right to be the one that you wish to show as the root. Now, you've likely encountered TapGesture before. Consider this simple Swift view. We want to trigger some simple implicit scale animation when the user taps on this red circle. We can use an onTap gesture to do this, but first we need to create an @state variable that will change when the circle is tapped and will initiate a change in the state to refresh our view. We set this up as a isTapped with an initial value of false. So now we can initiate a .scale effect that when tapped will scale our circle down to 0.5. And we will add an implicit ease in out animation with a duration of half a second. Now all we have to do is add a simple dot and tap gesture with a closure that will toggle the isTapped variable. So dot onTap gesture self.isTapped.toggle. Now this form of .onTap gesture is actually a short form for the longer gesture modifier that allows you to specify all types of gesture modifiers to a view. We could have written a modifier like this. Now let's open Quick Help with an option click on the tap gesture to display Quick Help. And it's nice because it provides you some sample code, but I want to look at the full developer documentation. We see that we can use a count property when we create the tap gesture that will require a number of taps before the gesture action is performed. Now this is not an optional property, so why did we not have to specify a count in the first place? And the answer is in the init. We see that a default value of 1 is used when the gesture is initialized, so we don't need to specify that at all, if that's what we want. However, if we want to wait for 2 taps, for example, then we need to add an argument. We can also use 2 different functions when performing the gesture. The updating gesture will become very handy in other types, but not here. However, the onEnded is. Once our gesture has ended, that's when we want to toggle our state variable to trigger our action. So back in our code, we can start with .onEnded and hit enter on the action to get our completion. Now, since it's a trailing closure, it takes no parameters, we can remove it entirely and also remove the outside parentheses. Now we can toggle our state variable, and since we are in a closure, I currently need to add .self. Now remember, there is that other property that we can add that allows you to specify a number of taps. Let's say we want a count of 2. So let's preview this now. I see that nothing happens if I tap once, but if I tap 2 times in succession, the scaling happens. Well, sometimes you want to combine a gesture with another gesture to create a new one that recognizes both gestures at the same time. We'll go into more complicated composite gestures in the last video in this series, but let's see if we can just add 2 tap gestures together. So let's add a new @state variable called isTap3 that is initially false. And we're going to use this to change the color of the circle if it's tapped 3 times. So we'll use the ternary operator with the fill modifier to make those changes. If isTap3, the color is green, else it's red. Let's just try to add another gesture with a count of 3. And in the closure, we'll just make sure that isTap3 is toggled on ended. If I test this, I can tap 3 times, but the 2 tap gesture intercepts it and our color change never happens. If I reverse the 2 gestures, the 3 tap changes the color, but it doesn't scale. To resolve this, after the first gesture, I can add a simultaneous modifier that allows me to specify another gesture, so that both gestures will be taken into account simultaneously. So let's just cut and paste our second gesture and replace this placeholder with it. Testing now, if we just double tap, the scaling happens. But if we triple tap, both scaling and the color change happens. The next gesture I want to look at is the long press gesture. And a long press gesture is similar to the tap gesture in that the view can react when another view is tapped. With a long press gesture, you specify the length of time that you want to have your user hold down on the view before the gesture's closure is executed. For example, let's use this same red circle. It already has a state variable set up as isLongPressed and with the default value as false. What we want to do is scale it down as we did with the tap gesture with an ease in-out duration as we did before. Now there is a short form for the long press gesture just as there is for the tap gesture. There are 2 initializers for LongPressGesture. One that accepts 2 arguments in a closure, and another one that accepts no arguments in a closure. So let's take that simple short form and see what happens. So in the closure, we'll just toggle isLongPressed. So if we test this now, we can tap and hold, and eventually we get our scaling. If I tap and hold and then move off our circle, however, the scaling doesn't occur. So let's take a look at the longer form of this gesture. And the reason I use the longer form is because I find it easier to inspect the documentation. So let's do that, and there are 2 properties initialized: minimum duration and maximum distance. The minimum duration is the minimum amount of time that the long press must elapse before the gesture succeeds. And the maximum distance is the maximum distance the long press can move before the gesture fails. So what would happen if I didn't use any of these values? Tapping on minimum duration, I see that there is a default value of 0.5, so half a second, if we didn't specify a duration. For the max distance, we see that this is a CG float of 10. So we can extend our minimum duration to say 1 second, and also extend the maximum distance as well. The other thing I want to check is the updating function. We can with this gesture know when our finger is still down, and when it is, there is a gesture state variable, and it's a boolean that will change to return true when the tap is being held down, and then it'll revert back to its original value, false, when it's over. The key thing to note is that this refers to a gesture state variable, and this function will bind that updated state to the variable. So let's do that. Let's set a minimum duration of 1 second and a maximum distance of 400. In our closure, we'll start our onEnded modifier and toggle our isOnPress state variable so that our scaling will still happen. Now in this closure, unlike the TapGesture closure, there is an argument, so we just can't remove this boolean. But since we're not going to use that value in our closure, we'll just use an underscore and set our isLongPressed equals to false. Now let's set up our updating function. And remember, I said that we need to bind that changing state to a gesture state variable. So let's create one, and I'll call it isLongPressing, and set its default to false. And we'll use the value of this gesture state to change the color of our circle. If true, that is when we're holding down our tap, the fill color will be green, otherwise red. With that in place, we can monitor that state using the gesture updating function that monitors the state. Now we'll provide our gesture state variable as the first argument. The callback that SwiftUI invokes as the gesture's value changes. The current state parameter is the updated state of the gesture, so we typically just call this value. Remember, it will be set to true for the minimum duration and then switch back to the default value, which was false. The second parameter is what will allow us to change that isLongPressing gesture state variable. It's an in-out value that we can change in our closure. And the final parameter is a transaction that I have yet to find a use for, so I'm just going to use an underscore here as I won't be using it. Now in the body of this closure, we can assign that in-out variable state to whatever our current value is, which is true until the duration has been met. And this state is bound to our isLongPressGesture state variable. So let's recap. When someone starts to long press on this circle, the value changes to true and updates the state in-out variable, which then updates the isLongPressing variable, which in turn updates our view. Once the long press has been completed, or it fails, the state value automatically resets back to the original value. So we can use this knowledge to update our UI. So let's test this out. Tapping and holding for 1 second keeps it green, and then after 1 second turns back to red and scales down. Let's just clean up our updating function a little because this is a trailing closure. I can remove the body and our closing parentheses here and just leave the trailing closure on its own. I don't even need the parentheses around the arguments either. So in our next video, we'll take a look at the drag gesture. I have lots of other videos available and in the queue as well, so please check out the rest of my channel. You can also visit my website to see the apps that I have available on the App Store, and visit my GitHub page to see what I have available as public repositories. If you like what you've seen, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And ring the bell to get notified when I post new videos. I'm most active on Twitter, so please follow me there as well to find out what else I'm up to. Thanks for watching.